All right, AMP1 students, in this video we're going to continue talking about the skeletal muscle tissue, specifically the fibers, skeletal muscle fibers and cells. So let me go to our objectives, you know where we're at with this video. So we already, the last couple of weeks, we've covered our skeletal muscle cell anatomy and skeletal muscle cell physiology. So now that we have an understanding of how skeletal muscles function, now we can understand some processes and disorders. So that is where we're at. We're going to talk about rigor mortis. So before we talk about rigor mortis, we need to kind of review the events and kind of understand how the skeletal muscle cells relax, and then we can talk more about rigor mortis. So just as a kind of an overview, go back to our picture here. So this is the picture showing all the steps in our skeletal muscle physiology that we learned last week. So I just want you to realize that in order for a skeletal muscle cell to relax, the first thing that has to happen is we have to have no more action potentials or nerve impulses traveling down the axon and going to the axon terminal or the synaptic bulb. So we have to have those gone. If we have those gone, we don't have the action potential being propagated or traveling along the sarcolemma and going down the T-tubules. And if we don't have that action potential, then we won't have the opening of these calcium channels in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So no more calcium can leave the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then any calcium that's actually left in here from a previous stimulation for a contraction, it doesn't just kind of still hang out in here. It gets pumped, so actively transported, back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum through calcium pumps. So there's some calcium pumps. They don't actually show them on here, but they will continue to pump any calcium that's left in the sarcoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So if we're not contracting, if we don't have that signal action potential for contraction, then we don't want any calcium floating around in here. So it'll all get pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum through the calcium pumps. And remember, since that's an active transport, it requires energy, and it's primary active transport, so it does require an ATP molecule. All right, and then if we don't have any calcium in the sarcoplasm, that means that our little troponin goes back to its original shape. And if it goes back to its original shape, the tropomyosin will shift and block, kind of cover over the myosin binding sites on actin. And if those are blocked, there's no way the myosin heads can attach to the actin. So then we stop the cross-bridge cycle too. And then if we don't have this cross-bridging between the thick myosin heads of the thick myofilaments and the actin of the thin myofilaments, then our muscle will relax. So all those sarcomeres will relax and cause the whole skeletal muscle cell to relax. So that is kind of just the steps that would cause skeletal muscle relaxation. So we need to understand that's how skeletal muscles stay relaxed, as well as we learn the steps on how a skeletal muscle contracts. So now we can talk about rigor mortis. And they actually have a little box at the end of this section that talks about rigor mortis. But everybody's probably pretty familiar with the fact that when we die, so rigor mortis is that condition where somebody that has passed away will have diffuse muscle contractions throughout their body. And there'll be sustained muscle contractions. So they contract, the muscles contract and they do not relax. So that person is very stiff and they're kind of set in that position that they're in, right before rigor mortis set in. All right, so the reason, now we're going to talk about why rigor mortis happens. And so after we've passed away, realize we're not breathing in any more oxygen, we have we have to have oxygen to make most of our ATP, which is our energy. So if we don't have any oxygen, we don't have any ATP being produced anymore. We'll have some still in our cells, but it takes a couple of hours to use all that ATP up. So once it's all completely used up, all that ATP, realize we don't have any ATP to power those calcium pumps in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Those are the ones that will actively transport calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So what that means is any calcium that's in the sarcoplasm stays in the sarcoplasm. So we do have calcium, because of the lack of ATP, still floating around in the sarcoplasm. So we know that if you have calcium in there, that's going to cause the calcium to bind to troponin and cause troponin to change shape so that the tropomyosin moves out of the way of those myosin binding sites on actin. And then you'll have the myosin heads attach. So we'll get that attachment. So here's the other role of ATP, remember, is it binds to the myosin heads, and then it's what causes the myosin heads to be able to detach from the actin. So be able to break that cross bridge. But if we don't have any ATP, then those little myosin heads stay attached to the thin myofilaments of the actin in there. And so then we get this sustained contraction of the muscles. There's no way that they can detach because we don't have any ATP to bind to them to weaken that attachment between the myosin head and the actin. And then realize that the calcium is just going to remain in the sarcoplasm, because eventually things that need energy to function, they're going to start to break down, and that's sarcoplasmic reticulum, same way. So like all the calcium that's in it will start to be released in there. Now this doesn't last forever, because eventually even the skeletal muscle cell and all of its components will start to break apart, and then so like the thin and thick myofilament proteins will just start to decompose too, and then everything kind of falls apart, and so then you won't have that sustained contraction anymore, because everything's pretty much decomposed and letting go of each other for another reason, which is because all the parts are breaking down, bonds are being broken. So that is rigor mortis. And again, it's kind of starts with the fact that we can't get the calcium that's in the sarcoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum through the calcium pumps, because we don't have ATP to give the energy for that to happen. So calcium stays in there. We'll get the cross bridges formed, and then cross bridges can't be unformed. They can't detach from each other because, again, lack of ATP. So it's mainly because of the ATP that the whole rigor mortis will happen. And there's a lot of information about, when rigor mortis will happen and what factors affect when it will happen. I won't ask you questions about that. I just mainly want you to understand what it is and what's causing it to occur in the human body. So, all right, so that is rigor mortis. All right, the next thing, let me go back to our objectives. The next few things we're going to talk about, we actually might only get to talk about myasthenia gravis. So even though rigor mortis is one of those conditions that will affect all of us at some point, most likely, because we're all going to pass away, there are some diseases that may or may not affect us, and that's what the next objective is. So we're going to talk about myasthenia gravis, tetanus, and botulism. So in this video, with the time left, we'll probably just get over myasthenia gravis, and then we'll talk about botulism and tetanus in the next video. Okay, so myasthenia gravis is a disease, and it's an autoimmune disease, and you may recall that we talked about an autoimmune disease when we were covering the articulation or joints chapter, and that was rheumatoid arthritis, and we talked about how the immune system can get confused and make antibodies against normal parts of the human body, and that can cause the breakdown of those and destruction of those parts. So myasthenia gravis works that way too. So it's where the person's immune system starts attacking a part of the body that should be there, a normal part of the body, and destroying it so that it can't function properly. Okay, so and you'll see signs and symptoms with this is muscle fatigue and weakness. So fatigue and weakness. So I'm going to show you a video. I don't have a video of a person with this condition. Okay, make sure this works this time. It messed up the last time, so we're going to start this video over. Okay. So hopefully you notice that that dog is having some muscle weakness and fatigue. And he doesn't want to go any further. He's so tired. His muscles are anyway. So he has an IV catheter in his right cephalic vein, and they're going to inject a medication into the vein. And this is a medication that will test whether he does have myasthenia gravis, and they're flushing it with some saline. Now we're going to watch him walk again. Still a little bit weak and fatigued, but all of a sudden, he's doing great. Walking, skeletal muscles are getting the signal, and he's running around normally. All right, so we're going to go back to our picture here, and we're going to talk about what myasthenia gravis is. It affects the acetylcholine receptors. So remember I said it's an autoimmune disease, which means that the body mistakenly makes antibodies that are against something that that's a normal part of the body. And in this case, it's the acetylcholine receptor. So I'm going to enlarge our little picture here and recall that these are the acetylcholine receptors. There's the name over here. They abbreviated acetylcholine. And so in this case, antibodies bind to these. And when antibodies bind to something in the body, that marks them for destruction. So white blood cells will come in and they'll see the antibodies on these structures and they'll destroy them. So what happens in people or animals that have this condition, they have fewer of these acetylcholine receptors in their sarcolemma of their skeletal muscle fibers. And so that would definitely cause muscle fatigue or weakness, because you need those acetylcholine receptors to allow for the action potential to be generated along the sarcolemma, so it can travel down the transverse tubules and stimulate the muscles to contract. So if we don't have enough of these, so you might get occasionally a action potential going down the sarcolemma, but not like it's supposed to, and not as strong. So that's why we'll see muscle fatigue and weakness in a person or an animal with this condition. So fortunately, there are some treatments for this condition to help with the normal skeletal muscle contractions, and it can be fatal if left untreated, because our diaphragm is a skeletal muscle, and that's vital for normal respiratory functioning. So that is myasthenia gravis, and in the objectives it kind of goes over the main points that you should be familiar with that disease. And in the next video we'll talk about botulism and tetanus, which are more bacterial infections that can happen in people. So I'll see you in the next video.